From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you're bearing up under this long pandemic, and we look forward to greeting you back in the grill room just as soon as conditions permit. If you spend much time in bookstores and you live in the Bay Area, you've already heard of our speaker today and her wonderful store, Sausalito Books by the Bay. Her topic is women writers who've turned heads and turned history. From Jane Austen to Anais Nin, Virginia Wolff, Zadie Smith, and masters of every genre, Cheryl will review 2 centuries of remarkable female writers. She's a former marketing executive, published writer, former journalist, and even radio talk show host. Cheryl is also the founding director and curator of the Sausalito Film Festival, and she chairs the Sausalito-Cascais Sister City program. What a cool thing between Sausalito and this famous seaport in Portugal. Cheryl, welcome to Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you, Ron. I'm delighted to be joining you today. It's fascinating to note that until the last 100 years, women writers couldn't even use their real names. They published anonymously or using a nom de plume. And yet many of them made significant contributions to the literary world. And while ignored, if not shamed at the time, they're now considered thought leaders and literary pioneers. And women writers increasingly have found their voice in the 20th century. Even more so today, especially women of color. So we're going to go back a few centuries and take a chronological look at some of these luminaries, women writers, as you said, who've turned heads and made history. Some will be familiar, some may not. If you haven't read these authors, I suggest you do. They all have withstood the test of time and have all made a big difference. Jane Austen, most people probably heard of this very famous English novelist who was best known for 6 major novels, including Sense and Sensibility and, of course, Pride and Prejudice. All of them interpret, critique, and comment on the British landed gentry at the end of the 18th century. Her work is said to be a transition to 19th century literary realism in that it provided biting irony and social commentary, a writing style that earned her a lot of acclaim among critics and scholars. That being said, her books were all first published anonymously. No one knew who was writing them. But boy, have they made a comeback. Just think about Downton Abbey and Bridgerton, the series these days. They have passed the test of time. There's even now a new gay rom-com take on Pride and Prejudice on Hulu called Fire Island. Another famous author, Mary Shelley, also an English novelist who is credited for inventing the very first science fiction novel, which you've all heard of, Frankenstein. One of my book clubs recently reread this book, and it is an absolutely captivating, complex psychological drama, which is a profound study of human nature, which in so many ways, it's not really about the monster movies you hear. It's far more in-depth than that, and it's as relevant today as it ever was. George Eliot, whose real name was Mary Ann Evans, is considered one of the leading writers of the Victorian era, but was known by her pen name, George Eliot. Although female authors were published under their own names during her lifetime, she wanted to escape that stereotype of women's writing, which at the time was tended to be very lighthearted romance or other fare that wasn't taken very seriously. She wrote 7 novels. Middlemarch was the most famous. And her work is distinguished for its realism, psychological insight, and sense of place. Emily Dickinson, everyone's heard of this famous poet. She's regarded as one of the most important figures in American poetry. Her canon has endured throughout the ages, but she too was relatively unknown in her lifetime. She was a prolific writer, but only 10 of her nearly 1,800 poems were published during her lifetime. Her poems were very unique for the era because they had short lines, typically lacked titles, and often used what's called slant rhyme, as well as very unconventional capitalization and punctuation. When her first collection was finally published, not until after her death in 1890, every one of her poems was heavily edited by men to fit the conventional poetic rules of the day. But finally, not until 1955, a complete and pretty much unaltered collection of her poetry was made available. So much has been written about her isolation and eccentricity, as well as her sister Lavinia. Many books have written. Probably, as I said, one of the most famous female poets in history. Emily and Charlotte Bronte. Yes, there were three Bronte sisters, but we're skipping Anne because we don't have that much time. These two sisters were known for their Gothic romance novels that really became classics in English literature. Charlotte, of course, wrote Jane Eyre. Emily, Wuthering Heights. As we know, Heathcliff lives on in many iterations today. They too first published their books using pseudonyms. Louisa May Alcott. We probably all know the coming of age novel Little Women and the four March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, and the details of their passage from childhood to womanhood, which are chronicled in this book. Pundits say that Alcott created a new form of literature, one that took elements from romantic children's fiction and merged them with a sentimental novel, creating what was considered a totally new genre at the time. Edith Wharton, one of my favorites, an American novelist, short story writer, and designer, drew upon her insider's knowledge of the upper class New York aristocracy to realistically portray the lives and morals of what we call the Gilded Age. She became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize in Literature for her novel, The Age of Innocence. Wharton wrote the book in her 50s and was really one of the first female authors to gain traction in the publishing world and was in very high demand. Willa Cather, a name not everyone knows, but she was an American writer best known for her writing about the Great Plains in America. O Pioneers is probably her best known work about a family of Swedish American immigrants in the farm country near a fictional town in Nebraska at the turn of the 20th century. She achieved recognition as a novelist based on her writing about the frontier and pioneer experience. And it is, by the way, a very popular motif and theme today, exile, the immigrant experience. Many current titles beg for comparison with this, but in 1923, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for another one of her books, One of Ours, a novel set during World War II, another pioneer female author. A very colorful, controversial female author, Gertrude Stein, was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, raised in Oakland, moved to Paris in 1903, where she stayed the remainder of her life. She was considered an American novelist and playwright, but also the consummate bohemian. She hosted a very famous Paris salon where the leading figures of modernism in literature and art gathered: Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, Matisse. Her modernist writing style was very distinct, broken grammar, illogical writing flows, and was considered very innovative at the time. In 1933, she published a quasi-memoir of her Paris years, which is very famous, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, written in the voice of her life partner, Alice B. Toklas. The book became a literary bestseller, vaulted Stein from the relative obscurity of cult literature into the limelight of mainstream attention. Stein, like George Eliot and Willa Cather, was a lesbian, another way these ladies were turning heads at the time, a key figure in 20th century feminism. We talked about Virginia Woolf briefly earlier, another English writer, also considered one of the most modernist authors of her period. She challenged the social injustices that women suffered in the 1900s and is considered a pioneer in what's called the stream of consciousness as a narrative device. And that was especially found in one of her more famous books you may have heard of, A Room of One's Own. One of her best known books, which is much heralded today, was the novel Mrs. Galloway. She became a central subject of the 1970s movement of feminist criticism, and her works have attracted a lot of attention, and she's considered one of the key women who inspired feminism and also drowned herself at a young age, but that's a whole nother story. These women all have fascinating personal histories. Dorothy Parker, she was an American writer, critic, and satirist based in New York, and then became a Hollywood screenwriter. She wrote for the New Yorker magazine, was a member of the legendary Algonquin Round Table. She was best known for her wit and her wisecracks and her eye for 20th century urban foibles. She really paved the way, I think, for other women who wrote about comedy and had humor. And one of my favorite of her lines is, "One martini, two at the most, three martinis, I'm under the host." That was vintage Dorothy Parker, a pioneering woman of letters. Another one of my all-time favorites is Karen Blixen, who wrote under the pen name Isaac Dennison, a Danish author who was also a baroness. And she's best known, of course, for Out of Africa. And while living in Kenya, she met English big game hunter Dennis Fitch Hatton in 1918, played by Robert Redford in the movie. She endured a messy divorce and was very controversial in that she took over the running of her African farm in 1921, which women did not do in those days. So not only did her writing expose the vagaries of the life of privilege in those days, but also of living in the African bush and the perils of colonialism. Both Out of Africa and another one of her books, Babette's Feast, were made into Academy Award-winning pictures. Dame Agatha Christie, who's not heard of her? She is considered the best-selling novelist of all time, with 66 detective novels, 14 short story collections, and the world's longest running play in London, Mousetrap. It started in 1952. We all know and love her fictional detectives, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. Her novels have sold more than 2 billion copies. Almost all of her books and short stories have been adapted for television, radio, video games, graphic novels. There are more than 30 feature films based on her work alone. One of her favorite books in my mind is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's considered to be one of the best crime novels ever, and it was written years and years and years ago. Daphne de Borier was another romantic novelist who also wrote sort of psychological thrillers, and her stories were considered very moody and resonant. While she was not originally taken very seriously, she's now very admired for her narrative craft. And I'm going to break for a minute from our chronological review, talk about how Agatha Christie and de Maurier have inspired other women to write mysteries and thrillers about female protagonists. These are more modern day detective heroines and their female creators, whether it's Louise Penny, Jacqueline Winspear, Cara Black. All of them feature female private investigators, female protagonists, strong women. There's a new form of literature that's referred to as griplit today, a genre that features female authored thrillers, mysteries with female heroines. It's usually very dark fiction, but written by women, and you've probably heard of some of it. Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, Girl on a Train, In the Dark, Dark Wood, Ruth Ware. These psychological thriller genre is not new or unique, but it was with Agatha Christie and with Daphne de Borier. And this whole genre is definitely having a comeback, and Hollywood's paying a lot of attention. So now we're going back in time to Pearl Buck, a very famous American novelist who is best known for The Good Earth, which was a best-selling novel in the United States in 1931 and won the Pulitzer the next year in 1932. She also won the Nobel Prize in Literature, basically for her very rich, epic descriptions of peasant life in China and the 2 memoir biographies of her missionary parents. She was the first American woman to ever win that prize. Anais Nin, French-born American memoirist, essayist, novelist. I consider her, as do others, the grande dame of erotica and journaling. In 1944, published a collection of short stories titled Under a Glass Bell, but is probably best known again for her bohemian lifestyle and her memoirs, which were very scandalous at the time. She paved the way for the Erica Jongs and Gina Frangellos of today, other famous, more contemporary writers who enjoy detailing their private sexual lives. Anais Nin had many marriages, including to the very famous writer Henry Miller, but also, this always makes me grin, to a very much younger man, Rupert Pole was 16 years younger than she was. She met him in an elevator and they went off and got married, even though she was still married to another man. So she had a very colorful personal history as well. There's so much more we could talk about. Ayn Rand started out as Alice O'Connor. Actually, she started out as Elisa Zinoveniana Rosenbaum. Then she became Alice O'Connor, but her pen name was Ayn Rand. She was a Russian-born American writer and philosopher, born and educated in Russia. She moved to the US in 1926. She achieved fame for her 1943 novel, The Fountainhead, and in 1957 published probably her best-known book, Atlas Shrugged. She turned a lot of heads with what was called objectivism at the time, and it was her philosophical system that she applied to life. And it basically was one of very severe rationalism that defied all faith and religion. So I've talked mostly about fiction writers so far, but I strongly believe that the storytelling skills of nonfiction writers could be so important in engaging and educating people. And Rachel Carson was one such writer, a nature writer whose words changed policies, impacted critical environmental issues. And again, nature writing was historically characterized by works written by white men. Rachel Carson changed that. An American marine biologist, writer, and conservationist, she was perhaps the finest nature writer in my mind in the 20th century. She was a student of nature, an ecologist, long before that science was formed and it was so fashionable. She wrote 24 books. The most influential was Silent Spring, which warned of the dangers of chemical pesticides such as DDT. She questioned the scope and direction of modern science and was really responsible for creating this grassroots environmental movement that led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Silent Spring was an international bestseller, raised the environmental consciousness of a generation. And she did so much. Silent Spring became a noisy summer because she really advanced the environmental movement and paved the way and set an example for other women who've written about nature. I'm just going to rattle off some contemporary names: Sylvia Earle, Cy Montgomery, who did Soul of an Octopus, Greta Thunberg, the young girl. No One is Too Small to Make a Difference. Helen Montgomery, who's written H for Hawk, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I could go on and on and on, but Rachel Carson is one of my all-time nonfiction heroines when it comes to writing in that genre. You have to know about her and read her books to appreciate what an incredible influence she was. Simone de Beauvoir was a French existentialist, philosopher, writer, social theorist, feminist, activist. She wrote novels, essays, biographies, autobiographies. She wrote a lot about philosophy, politics, and social issues. She's best known for her 1949 treatise, The Second Sex, which was a detailed analysis of women's oppression and a foundational track for contemporary feminism. Probably the most enduring contribution to literature, however, are some of her memoirs, for which she won many awards. And she was also very well known and famous for her lifelong relationship with that very, very famous, very incredibly intelligent French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. Another nonfiction writer I want to make note of is Barbara Tuckman. She won the Pulitzer Prize twice, once for Guns of August, which was a best-selling history about the behind-scenes political machinations that led to World War I in the summer of 1914, and then also for Stilwell and the American experience in China. She focused on writing history and favored what is called a literary approach, which means it was a narrative style that made history actually interesting, which is, I think, really how people enjoy learning about history. It has to tell a story, it has to be interesting. And her storytelling prowess made the past interesting to millions of readers. That's why I think she's so important. Doris Lessing was a British Zimbabwean novelist from Rhodesia, which used to be Rhodesia. She was also a very uninhibited and outspoken writer who won the 2007 Nobel Prize for Literature. Her writing shattered both social and artistic convention. Dozens of novels, short stories, essays, poems, many of which drew on her childhood in the Central African bush. Ursula Le Guin is probably the reigning royalty of American science fiction for half a century. Again, she broke ground where very few women had traveled in a traditionally male-dominated literary world of science fiction. She is an American author, best known for her works of what we call speculative fiction, which is a supernatural futuristic genre that includes science fiction, dystopian fantasy, anything sort of unreal and unbelievable. Her literary career spanned 60 years, in which she produced more than 20 novels and over 100 short stories, poetry, literary criticism, children's books, you name it. She received many, many accolades in her lifetime. And really, when it comes, there was Mary Shelley centuries ago who wrote the first science fiction novel, and that was her only real science fiction novel, but Ursula Le Guin certainly made up for her centuries later. Betty Friedan is another very famous female writer associated with American feminism. She was a leading figure in the women's rights movement in the United States, and her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, is often credited with sparking American feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. The book gave voice to millions of American women's frustrations with sexism and chauvinism at home and in the workplace, and really helped spark public activism in that era for gender equality. She was co-founder of the National Organization of Women, organized the nationwide women's strike for equality, and which was all about the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. And she was also a strong supporter of the equal rights movement, which was eventually passed into law. So her 6 books and very powerful voice have made a big influence in women's lives and everyone's lives today. The next author is sort of a one-hit wonder. She never wrote anything but To Kill a Mockingbird, but I really want to include her because not only did it win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961, but it's really a classic in American literature, notable for exposing racist attitudes and class discrimination in the Deep South in that era. And since the book is told from the eyes of 2 children, they really didn't have that discrimination, but the adults in the book do. She received many accolades and honorary degrees, but never read another novel. And so I guess my message to all those struggling authors who have writer block and they've only done one novel, don't despair. One novel can make a huge difference. And Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind, comes to mind in that category as well. She also just wrote one novel, but it was epic and historical. Maya Angelou, most people, regardless of their class or color, have heard of this iconic American poet and memorist who was a huge civil rights activist. She was best known for her 7 autobiographies, which focus on her childhood and early adult experience. Her first book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, in 1969, very, very famous, brought her international recognition and acclaim. She too has received dozens of awards, more than 50 honorary degrees. She was active in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and has always been a champion for African American women. There's so much more we could say about her as well. I'm racing through this. Toni Morrison is another very famous African American novelist and editor who was made famous by her ability to depict the Black American experience with such authenticity. She was the first Black female editor in fiction at Random House in New York City in the late 1960s, which, if you know how draconian the publishing world is, was huge. Male-dominated, white male-dominated, was huge that she was given this opportunity. And in the 1970s and mid-80s, published her most famous works, including Beloved, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1987 and was later made into a movie. 6 years later, she was awarded, based on that and other work, the Nobel Prize in Literature. So she was truly a remarkable woman. Margaret Atwood is a Canadian-born poet, novelist, literary critic, teacher, environmental activist. She was most famous for creating the dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale. in 1985, which was later adapted into a very popular television series. And if you don't think this book made an impact, take a look at the recent abortion rights protests in which women were dressed as the handmaids in Atwood's book. The handmaids in her book were forcibly assigned to produce children for the commanders, the ruling class of men in the book. So that's probably her most famous novel, but she was a very prolific writer with a very sharp tongue. She published 18 books of poetry, 18 novels, 11 books of nonfiction, 9 collections of short fiction, 8 children's books, 2 graphic novels. It goes on, and she's not over yet. She just published another book. So she's won numerous awards and honors for her writing, including 2 Booker Prizes, which is a very prestigious literary award. Joyce Carol Oates is another very, talk about prolific contemporary author. She has penned and published 58 novels to date. She's a short story writer, a memoirist, and like many of the women in this presentation, also an activist. She often employs historical settings and different literary genres, but her themes tend to be about evil in modern society, rural poverty, sexual abuse, class tensions. Her books are gripping. They're gripping reads. You don't have to start at the beginning. You can pick up almost any one of them and be absolutely captivated. One shift we've seen in recent decades is a lot more of color when it comes to authors, but particularly female authors. Not only an increase in Black women writers, but also Hispanic, Asian, and other women of color. And probably at the top of my list there is Isabel Allende, a Chilean-American writer. She's perhaps one of the most notable and longstanding Hispanic women writers of note. She's 80 years old and has been writing all of her life, from House of Spirits, her first seminal novel, to her most recent memoir, Soul of a Woman, Violetta, Japanese Lover, Zorro, Long Paddle of the Sea. Her books go on and on. She is considered, quote unquote, the world's most widely read Spanish language author. And if you read her work, you can understand why. She often incorporates aspects of magical realism and almost always pays homage to the lives of women. So she's made an incredible impact on not only Latin American world, but the world of literature. None of it can be overestimated, and very much an activist when it comes to supporting women and children. She has a whole foundation devoted to that. Alice Walker, an American novelist, short story writer, poet, also a social activist. In 1982, she became the first African-American woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for her novel, Color of Purple, which is all about the strength and independence of Black women. The book was turned into an Oscar-nominated film in 1985, a Broadway musical in 2005, and it's going to get a second film adaptation next year in 2023. Another prolific woman writer, 17 novels, short story collections, 12 nonfiction works, essays of collections of essays and poetry. She too has achieved legendary status in her lifetime. Louise Erdrich is a Native American author. A lot of people don't realize that that's her heritage. She's the author of 28 books of fiction and nonfiction, novels, poetry, children's books, almost all of them featuring Native American characters and settings. She's a I hope I can say this right, Turtle Mountain Chippewa Indian, which is part of the federally recognized tribe of Anishinaabe. She was awarded just last year the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for her novel, The Night Watchman, which is based on a community's efforts to halt the proposed displacement and elimination of several Native American tribes in the 1950s. So a book that's well worth the read, as are all of hers. Another woman of color, a celebrated British American Indian novelist who's best known for her depiction of immigrant and Indian American life. Her especially poignant stories also capture the universal themes of longing, loneliness, barriers of communication. I loved her debut collection of short stories called The Interpreter of Maladies. Came out in 1999, and it won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. This amazing woman was born in London, raised in Rhode Island, now lives in Italy, where she's writing and translating in Italian as well as English. So an incredible woman. Zadie Smith is an up-and-coming English novelist, essayist, and short story writer who is now a creative writing professor at New York University. Her debut novel, White Teeth, became an international bestseller overnight with its very eccentric characters, savvy humor, very snappy dialogue. And she is best known for her treatment of race, religion, and cultural identity. And I know we are going to see more from this author. Before I close, I want to do a shout out to women authors of children's books, because we all know children's books can be hugely influential and help establish important role models for little girls. I know they did me. There was Peppi Longstocking, Anne of Green Gables, Nancy Drew with her, Carolyn Keene with her Nancy Drew series. Nancy Drew really, she was an early feminist, I think. She told her boyfriend what to do. She drove her own convertible. She worked for her father, the detective lawyer. I mean, she was a huge role model for me. Women, girls, teenage girls didn't do those things in those days. More recently, J.K. Rowling, everybody's heard of her she's the best-selling children's young adult author in history with her Harry Potter series. And they too have a lot of strong girls. Harry Potter's a boy, but there are a lot of strong women in these books. Kate DiCamillo is another one of my incredibly favorite young adult authors. These authors and books are all very near and dear to my heart. And again, I could go on even further. There are dozens of other female writers, which I could have included here in this presentation, that I admire. It was not easy to vet and choose who to feature, but I'll just toss out some recent names who I think are amazing women writers. Sigrid Nunez, Olga Torshek, Krista Hanna, Kate Atkinson, Flannery O'Connor goes back a ways, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Octavia Butler, Hilary Mantel, her whole Wolf Hall trilogy, Sally Rooney, I could go on and on. Amy Tan actually is here in Sausalito, and I've had some interaction with her. She's not writing much these days, but she also broke ground with that book, The Joy Luck Club. So that's pretty much it, Ron. But I want to encourage all your viewers. You're welcome to give them my email address. And if you've got women writers who you think should be included in this, let me know. Send me an email. I would love to get feedback from people on the presentation, and encourage everybody, if you're in Sausalito, we've got free parking in downtown Sausalito. We're right on the waterfront. We're on the water, very close to the Sausalito Yacht Club and on the Sausalito Yacht Harbor Marina. We are open from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m., usually open later, but those are the official hours, 7 days a week.
Is there a historic arc? How have female writers changed from those first ones you covered then into today?
Well, for one, they can use their real name. They don't have to publish anonymously. There isn't shame associated with what they're writing. I think all of the women I talked about were pretty rebellious and pretty out there for their time and what they wrote about. They just didn't get the acknowledgement then that they do today. But I think a lot of them were pioneers. Obviously, the genres and the style of writing have changed. I think increasingly we see more female protagonists in books, not just those written by women, but by men as well. I think that people take female writers more seriously today than they did in the past. Men, it's funny, Ron Charles, who's the book editor at the Washington Post, writes about this as well. I got my inspiration from him. He said, men are always saying, oh, well, I don't really read novels. I don't read fiction. I need the story. I want nonfiction. I need to learn something from my writing. But that's slowly changing. More and more men are reading novels and appreciating what women have to say, and understanding that even in a fictional book of some sort, there can be many lessons learned. And sometimes it's subtle, sometimes not so subtle.
How do women writers, in your view, differ from men writers?
That's a tough question. I think every writer is different, regardless of sex, color. An argument could be made. In the old days, women were known for writing with more empathy and more romance, more feeling. I don't know. And I guess, this sounds sexist. I guess you could say that women still have or perhaps better in touch with their emotions. But I think a lot of men are today as well. But I think that sometimes women are able to tap into a deeper level and more layers of human emotion, which is what so many novels in particular are about.
Among the couple dozen authoresses that you covered today, what do you think median education level is?
Most of them were highly educated. A lot of these writers, particularly in earlier times, as you probably noted, were considered pretty eccentric, and they, probably shocking for their era, some of the things that they did and wrote about.
How would a female writer get published today?
More and more people, men and women, are self-publishing because they make more money that way. A big name female author who's established is still going to Penguin Random House, Simon Schuster, Norton. There are also some sort of what I call hybrid breakaway publishing houses like She Writes, which is in Berkeley. Brooke Warner has done a great job with that. And it's kind of a hybrid self-published, but we're your publisher as well format. I think it's almost, the publishing world, as I said noted earlier, is traditionally white male dominated. And women have broken through that glass ceiling to some extent. And as a result, women writers are getting more attention from those publishers. But that really only happened in the last few decades, I'd say. It was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was still very male dominated profession, and they were partial to male authors.
Talk about the marriage status of the writers you covered today.
I would say it's maybe 50-50. Half of them are married and half are not, or half of them were married. Some of them were married many times, as I noted. So there were a few who I think eschewed men, but I think by and large, most of them were, had male influences, and men were important in their life.
So you have a bookstore right in a high tourist area in a beautiful location. Congratulations on the beautiful location.
We are an independent bookstore, and that means we're competing with the Barnes and Nobles and the Amazons, and it's not easy, particularly since I opened 3 months before a global pandemic. We haven't had one normal year in business, so it's difficult for me to say, here's a day in the life of, but because we're small and independent, we do cater a little bit to all the visitors that get off buses outside our front door, but our loyal following and our loyal customers are our locals from Marin and even San Francisco. I do everything from curating books to working with publishers and publicists to stage live author events, children's events. I do our marketing, our social media, the merchandising, the table display, the window exhibits. I wear 5 hats, as well as being the owner and having a staff. Everyone on my staff they're avid readers, voracious readers. And I think what differentiates all independent bookstores, including ours, is that you can come in and have a conversation with someone, and they can help you curate what you want to read. And you can come in and say, you're talking to a live person who's really reads a lot of books and is knowledgeable. And that's something you don't get when you buy online. We also sell beer and wine. I have a beer and wine license. We have a beautiful parklet. Well, it's in a parking lot, but it's nice, right outside. So people can come read a book, sip a cup of coffee, have a glass of wine while they read and shop. We sell a lot of sidelines, which is other merchandise beside books, 60-75% books, but we have a lot of unique gifts as well. So we're trying to cater to our demographic. I opened the business as sort of a hobby. It was going to be my retirement plan. I retired from corporate America, and I've been working 7 days a week. So opening an independent bookstore is not for the faint of heart, particularly in the middle of a global pandemic.
How often do you host author events?
During the pandemic, we pivoted everything to Zoom, of course, but about 9 months ago, we started live events again, and we do 2 or 3 a week. And whether it's a poetry reading or tonight we're hosting 2 travel writers and tomorrow night, I have a wine tasting. We do something called Bottles and Books. So it's books to drink wine by, but it's also a wine tasting with a local vintner. And yesterday, Laura Dave, who wrote a great thriller, a novel called The Last Thing He Told Me, she's in town because Apple TV is making it into a miniseries. And she came by the store, as did a lot of her fans and following, and she signed books. So we do all kinds of different events with authors. And sometimes we've done community forums on racism and the environment, which involve civic leaders as well as authors. Again, we are selling books, but also community.
What about books about sailing?
We have a large collection of nautical maritime books, which does differentiate us from other bookstores. And that's because of our location, right by the Sausalito Yacht Club, on the marina, on the water. We work with the Sausalito Yacht Club to help them curate books for a monthly book club they have. And every book is about sailing, the sea, the ocean, something seaworthy. And we also co-host some author events, which I think you've been involved with at the club. So we're very proud of our nautical maritime collection. And I'm happy to help anyone curate. I call it my Books for the Boat program, because I think every boat should be well equipped with books, whether it's Moby Dick or Captain Courageous or whatever. So.
Cheryl Popp, what a delightful Wednesday yachting luncheon. I've been to your store and recommend it highly. Thanks for being such an articulate spokesperson for your profession and for authors in general, especially female authors. And I look forward to visiting you at your shop. So thanks so much for being with us. And, you've been a great guest.
Thank you, Ron. Fair winds.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.